Welcome to Off the Record, a legal podcast.
Welcome back to Off the Record. Today we have a special guest, Bill Finn, an attorney at the law office of Rhett, Burney in South Carolina. Bill handles a wide range of family law matters, is known for bringing a steady, practical, and compassionate approach to tough situations. I'm Evan Mack, and today we're talking about debt during divorce. Who's responsible for credit card balances, car loans, or the mortgage when the marriage ends, and how does South Carolina decide what's fair? Bill, welcome.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Awesome. Bill, when a couple divorces in South Carolina, how does the court generally view debt? Is it treated the same way as property, or is it something else?
Yeah, generally, if it's accumulated during the marriage, it's considered a marital debt. There are
Mm.
certain limited exceptions and things like that, but generally, if it's debt that was accumulated during the marriage and for the marriage, then it's going to be considered a marital debt, just like any assets or property.
What's the difference between that marital debt and that separate debt? How is that determined in South Carolina?
So it depends on the situation. That's a really fact specific question. But sometimes there's certain aspects of debt that can be taken out of the marital state. So sometimes that's student loans that one side pursued that weren't for the benefit of the marriage or weren't for like the advancement of the family or something like that. But that's a really fact specific question, and it really depends on the individual facts of each case.
If a credit card account is only in like the spouse's name, but was used for family expenses, can the other spouse still be responsible for that debt?
They sure can. Yep, it doesn't really matter whose name it is. If it was used for the marriage and those expenses can be shown that they were used for the marriage, then it generally is going to be considered a marital debt.
How can that be determined though? How can someone like prove that was going on, like that kind of spending? You know what I mean?
So sometimes that's pulling the actual credit card statements. Sometimes that's showing proof of where funds went, where funds came from. There's a wide variety of ways that can be shown, but generally there's a process in family cases called discovery, where you're getting documents and information from the other side, and they're getting the same from you. And that's generally where you kind of get some of that info, and where you can find what expenses were spent and what they were used for, and those sorts of things.
What about mortgages or car loans? How do they get divided when both names are on the paperwork, but only one person keeps the asset?
So generally, it's still considered marital debt. But if we're assigning that, if that person is keeping the asset in the end, then we have provisions in any kind of settlement agreement that say that that person is going to be responsible for the timely payment and associated costs of that asset. And then that agreement will also have generally that the parties will cooperate to refinance or remove names from those accounts if they're not receiving them in the end. But until you have that agreement and until you have a court approval of that agreement, it is marital, and it's important to stay on top of those debts because it can come back to both until you have a final resolution.
How important is it for this thing to be kind of handled amicably while it's going on, or as opposed to, contentious people fighting over what debt is going where and things like that?
Yeah, so I mean, amicably, it certainly makes a lot of cases generally easier, if everyone's cordial and amicable and we can figure out, okay, you're going to take this debt, you're going to take this debt, and we're going to go our separate ways, then, that just makes the process simpler in the end. But if everyone's, there's a lot of dispute or contention about what the debts are and where those debts came from, it can drag the case on, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, because if we're trying to have somebody not responsible for the debt, then we want to make sure we're doing our due diligence and doing everything we can to get that debt off of them. But it's just there's a wide variety of ways that those things can take as a case progresses, and it really just depends on the facts of the case and the current situation, what you can do about that and where those debts can be assigned to.
What happens if one spouse files for bankruptcy during or maybe after the divorce? Does that wipe out their share of the marital debt?
So that's a complicated question. Bankruptcy is
Yeah.
really complicated. Generally, bankruptcy has a legal stay on incurring debts and certain things. So when there's a bankruptcy attorney involved with someone in that's party, we generally work very closely with them to make sure that we're not in violation of any bankruptcy orders or bankruptcy stays as we're trying to resolve this. But bankruptcy can certainly have a big impact, and generally it's going to kind of put the divorce proceedings on hold until you figure out how that bankruptcy is going to shake out.
Is that common? And have you seen too many cases like that?
It's not, I wouldn't say it's common, but it's not necessarily uncommon either. If bankruptcy is a needed option, then sometimes that's the right thing to pursue. It really just depends. But, if somebody's looking to get divorced quickly, a bankruptcy is certainly not going to make it go quicker. But if there's big financial issues at play and large debt at play, it can certainly be a beneficial avenue to pursue, and something that we want to make sure is fully explored before you decide whether to file for bankruptcy or not. And again, we just would work closely with that bankruptcy attorney to make sure that the family case progresses in a way that's not going to affect the bankruptcy and vice versa.
Do judges in South Carolina look at who benefited from the debt when deciding who pays the debt?
They definitely can, especially when it comes to student loans incurred during the marriage. That's something they can look at. See, who incurred these loans, what was the purpose of it? Was the idea that the party that was going back to school was going to get a better job for supporting the family, or were they just doing this for fun of their own accord? Judges have a wide range of discretion when they're looking at things and how they attribute things, but they're going to look at the general purpose of the debt. Was it to serve the marriage? Was it for individual purposes? And take those factors into account if the judge is at a trial assigning debts and dividing assets.
What can people do before they file for divorce to get a clearer picture of what they actually owe and who's legally on the hook for everything?
Yeah, so a great way to do that is to maintain current credit reports. Make sure you're understanding everything that's listed on your credit. So if there's debts out there that you weren't aware of, you're in the knowledge before you file for divorce. It's also just a good idea to keep track of where your expenses are going. Keep track of your accounts, keep track of those debts, and keep an organized version of that. And then, of course, it's always good to meet with an attorney beforehand and see what they think and see, what kind of picture that their advice is going to show and where those debts are going to be assigned as the case progresses. Now, it's not something you can always answer before the case starts. It's not something you can necessarily answer until the case is going for a little while. But you can get a general idea based on how the debts were used and how those things were done for the purpose of the marriage, going into a divorce to see what am I going to be responsible for or what am I not going to be responsible for. But the general principle is that if it was debt incurred for the marriage, it's going to be considered marital debt.
How can separating finances too quickly, maybe like closing accounts or transferring these balances, create bigger problems later in the case?
Yeah, so if it's some marital assets and you close that account or you transfer it to something else, it doesn't change the fact that it's a marital asset. And now we've got to track it down. We've got to make sure that that money can be accounted for. If it can't be, then you might be responsible for reimbursing the other side a portion of what those assets were or what the balance of that account was, because it was marital prior to any court order, prior to any date of filing, and prior to any actual legal permission to separate those marital funds. So it can certainly complicate things. It can certainly make it harder to track where funds came from, what funds go to what. And then it can often mean reimbursing someone for any transferred funds that were marital and kind of an equalization of those funds.
I'm sure you've seen a lot of couples sort through complicated finances. What's one example that you might have of a smart, practical move that helps someone kind of leave the marriage on the solid financial footing instead of drowning in that old debt?
So my advice is always just be on the same page with your partner. Make sure y'all understand where your money's going. It's surprising how many times you'd see someone that say, well, they controlled all the finances and I had no clue where anything went. A lot of times that's easier if somebody's more financially minded and someone's able to keep on track of that. It's easier to be out of sight, out of mind. But that can hurt you in the end if you aren't aware of what was being spent, what those costs were. So it's a good idea to just be involved in all sides of your financial situation, no matter the status of your marriage, if it's good or you have an upcoming divorce. It's just a good idea to know where your money's going and where your funds are being spent. And then it's also just a good idea to meet with an attorney and see, hey, I'm thinking about a divorce. What should I do? And they'll give you some fact specific and situation specific advice as to what you should do and how you should be spending your money or moving your money or not. And those questions are all, again, it's very fact specific. It really just depends on the status of everybody's individual case and what's going on in their situation. But it's a good idea to meet with an attorney beforehand if you're considering to make sure, hey, if I would close this account, am I going to be on the hook for it later? Because you might. It really just depends.
Wow. Well, appreciate the time, sir.
Thanks for having me.
All righty. And that's it for today's episode of Off the Record with attorney Bill Finn of the law offices of Rhett Burney. To connect with Bill or learn more, visit rhettburney.com. Thanks for listening. And don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and share this information with someone else if they find it helpful. Thank you so much. We'll see you next time.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.